Boker Tov, good morning. Today we're talking about acacia wood. We'll be looking at a element of the tabernacle that is not very often, I don't think anyway, not very often discussed. Many people may not realize some of the implications of acacia wood. And I want to explain that to us because every aspect of the tabernacle has specific purpose and specific divine meaning. And we're going to be discussing that today as we're looking at the walls of the tabernacle and the base of the tabernacle. That's really the Aliyah today for Parashat Terumah is the walls themselves and the sockets the walls sit in. We're going to explain why these things, or what the meaning is, what the purpose is, and so on. So good morning. Glad you're here. Thank you so much for being here. I want to give a shout out to Zakin Yigal and to Daniel for sitting in for me and being an integral part of the Aliyah day. It's a blessing to have them to be able to do that. The daily Aliyah is a commitment. It's a unique tool. It's a unique opportunity. It's a unique program that I initiated a few years ago, whereby we would, have a daily Torah teaching. And the purpose of it, of course, is to naturally dive into the Word of God and have the opportunity to explain principles and to be able to connect with all of you. And so it's to do that daily is it's great. It's fun. It's a blessing. It's I would say it's a lot of work. I guess it is, but it's important. And so I appreciate for them to coming together and helping me when I can't always make it every single day. So Baruch HaShem, glad that is a blessing. Also, be sure and subscribe to our program, or to our channel, I should say, if you have not done so already. Like our video, comment on it. Many of you have been commenting, and it's a blessing, and I appreciate that so much. And of course, as always, please remember to donate generously to our ministry here. We really depend upon you in your faithful giving. If you, and I'm talking to you, ma'am, and you, sir, who are watching me, if you don't give, then we can't continue to do what we're doing. So I want to encourage all of you. Plus, it releases a tremendous amount of anointing in our lives. When we donate, when we just give, and we are just generous with our giving, it really unlocks a significant power within our life. In fact, the sages have said that one of the three key elements to restoration and teshuvah and healing spiritually and physically is actually giving tzedakah, giving charity. So remember that. It's very important. And that's why the Satan works so hard to make sure that you're discouraged from giving, because he realizes the power and the importance in all of that. So this morning, acacia wood, we're going to be looking, as I said, about the walls of the tabernacle. Everything that is made everything that's made in the tabernacle is made with wood, but specifically with acacia wood. So it naturally begs the question, why? Why does HaShem want us to use acacia wood? Why does it matter? Why can't we just use pine or I don't know, mahogany? Mahogany is a beautiful wood. Why can't we use that? Why can't we use some other kind of wood? I don't know. Can you a wood of a palm, perhaps, or something like that, or oak? Why does it have to be acacia? And there's a specific reason. I want to mention, I know that Daniel did a teaching, and it was good Aliyah on the cross versus the tree of life. I realize, and I appreciate, and I empathize with people who come from Christian backgrounds, and you have a psychological and an emotional attachment to the cross, the symbol of the cross. I totally get it. I understand it. I don't know that I ever really had that type of emotional attachment, nostalgic attachment, or spiritual attachment, or whatever. I don't think I did. But I get it. I understand where people come from. Me personally, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's a connection to the crucifixion stake and acacia wood. Everything in the tabernacle is made out of acacia to include the altar itself. And so this begs the question, there must be some type of connectivity to the crucifixion of Messiah. Is there? Maybe. We don't really know. So here's the point. My personality is such that I'm kind of, I'm very much into authenticity in a lot of different ways. And naturally, it permeates into the authenticity of the gospel, the authenticity of the Messiah. I don't want anything that's fake and phony and made up. And when I find out that something is fake and phony and made up and has no, no historical or whatever reality, I'm done with it. I'm not interested in it. I don't care what it means. I don't care how emotionally attached I am to it. Okay. And this is the cross. So the Christian cross that everybody is familiar with, that everybody and their dog wears. It doesn't mean you can be an absolute heathen. I've seen people wearing the cross around their neck and they are no more godly than Adolf Hitler. Okay. And likewise, I've seen other people wear the cross who are great and wonderful people. So anyway, point in fact is it means literally nothing. But when you actually get into the history of the cross, what you find out is that it was given to the world, not by God, not by any of the disciples, not by Yeshua, but rather by Constantine, who, and I know this has been covered, but I mean, it's important to say it again. Constantine was a reprobate. He's a lunatic. He was a straight up pagan. There was nothing, it's laughable to suggest that Constantine somehow believed in the God of Israel or the actual Messiah. That's a joke. He was a sadist. He actually was obsessed with the suffering and the death and the blood and guts of the Messiah. He's just a loony bird. Okay. And he had some type of vision. He was going to go into battle and he saw a cross in the sky and he said, by this emblem, you shall get the victory. Would God have said that to Constantine? Of course not. So the reason that people have a cross, the cross, the one that the vampires are afraid of, is not because of biblical anything. It's not even because of archaeology. That'd be even kind of okay. It's because of a lunatic. And did anybody use the cross prior to that? No. There's no. The answer is no. Okay. So it's phony, baloney, plastic banana, good time, rock and roll. It is actually a completely made up symbol. That's the point. Now, what does that have to do with the acacia wood? Well, the other interesting thing about the crucifixion devices is that the Romans crucified tens of thousands of people. We know that as a historical fact, which, by the way, it's always great to use historical facts and biblical facts. I've read, people have talked about this topic and they're like, they say things and like, where did you get, that's totally made up. Where, like, there's nothing just, well, that's what I think maybe possibly might have potentially kind of maybe happened, but that's okay. If you have a theory, you say, well, I think this might have been the thing. Well, hopefully that theory is based on some level of reality, but at least you can say, hey, I don't know. Like sometimes I'll do this. I'll say, I don't know. I think this is my theory, perhaps, but I don't have any evidence to back it up. That's fine. Okay. Because we all have the right to have those kinds of theories and opinions. And I think this might have been the case, but I don't know. Unless, of course, we're proven to be absolutely wrong, in which case we have to admit that we're wrong. Because maybe, historical reality, proves that we're wrong. But otherwise, if we don't know and nobody else knows, we can have a theory, right? But please don't submit your theory as if it's absolute fact. Is that okay? Is that fair to say? Because that happens a lot, at least with me. People will submit their theories as if it's absolute fact. And I'm thinking, where did you get that? Like, where in the world does it say that? Okay. So the fact of the matter is that archaeologists are somewhat perplexed in that even though the Romans have crucified tens of thousands of people, we have no archaeological evidence at all of what the crucifixion devices look like. Zero, zilch, nada. That's remarkable. And the historians will tell you, right, that the reality is the Romans pretty much used anything and everything. There was no crucifixion device. It was a tree, a pole, maybe a crossbeam. Could have been just pretty much anything. Okay. However, there is an interesting archaeological find that that they found in Jerusalem of a crucifixion victim. Okay. And in that, and so they had this ossuary, right, where they put the bones in there, and in there they found the bones of a crucifixion victim. And pardon me for being graphic here, but the nail, which was pretty big, that they used to penetrate the feet of the victim, was still lodged in the bones of the victim. And what they noticed, what they found was there's a piece of wood, and again, I apologize, but a piece of wood that was between the foot and the head of the stake that would prevent the victim from pulling his feet off of the nail, essentially. And what I found interesting is, again, remember, there's no archaeological evidence except for this one thing. And that piece of wood was acacia wood. And I find that interesting because I had, in my historical studies of this topic a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I read something where the Romans had a practice of putting bronze on their nails and so forth. I guess maybe it was to harden them or something that effect. I think I don't recall exactly the purpose, but I remember when I read that, I'm putting all this together and I'm thinking it's interesting to me that it's possible that the crucifixion wood might have been acacia, and it's coupled with bronze, which just happens to be the materials that the altar on which we would put our sin sacrifices in the tabernacle and temple. Now, am I suggesting here that all the crucifixion stakes were made out of acacia wood? Well, of course not. There's no way possible to know that. Is it possible that it was? Maybe. We don't really know. But I think it's interesting. Now, why acacia? Well, it's interesting when you look up acacia and find out that in Africa, particularly the African continent and in Egypt, the acacia wood itself has a lot of spiritual properties to it. It's used a lot, frankly, in witchcraft, and it's used for spells and things like that. Why? Well, because acacia was understood to be this very deeply spiritual element, this wood. And you might say to yourself, well, golly, if it was used in spells and things, why would God want to use that in the tabernacle? Well, understand that look, guys, the Satan creates nothing. Okay. So when people say to me, the Jews got that practice from Satan. No. That's never how it works. Okay. First of all that is casting shade on Jews. It's a form of anti-Semitism to suggest that we Jews get our practices from pagans or from occultists. All that is just anti-Semitism in another form. Okay. Moreover, remember that Satan, he's not creative. Okay. All he can do is take that which has spiritual potential and spiritual properties and misuse it for his own purposes. So before Satan was talking to his minions about using acacia and spells, long before that, God had established acacia as a spiritual tree. Okay. Interestingly, and I didn't know this until now, actually, I didn't realize it, but the tree that you see in a lot of the African savanna paintings and so forth is actually an acacia tree. I did not realize that. That kind of umbrella looking tree that's, has kind of like that umbrella look to it. It's really iconic in a lot of, as I said, African safari pictures or African savanna paintings or photographs. It's acacia. And so it's very prolific. It's used a lot in foods. Acacias are used in a lot of, in fact, we always used to joke with our Judy of blessed memory because she loved to drink RC Cola. And I used to say, well, the reason you like it, Judy, is because RC Cola happens to be a super holy soft drink. Because if you look at the ingredients of RC Cola, it has acacia in it. Acacia is used in a lot of things. In Africa, acacia is understood to be a tree that has to do with regeneration, with restoration, with integrity. Interestingly, about the acacia plant too, or acacia wood rather, is that it has thorns on it. It is essentially a thorn. I would say bush, but probably more accurate to call it a thorn tree. And these thorns are rather long. They can be 8 to 10 centimeters long, and they are razor sharp. Now, again, I don't know if this is true. This is my theory, but it would make sense if you actually look at the thorns of an acacia. And that's why on the thumbnail of this teaching today, I put a little picture of the thorns of the acacia up close so you can see them. It would make sense to me that the crown of thorns that was made for Yeshua was likely to be made out of an acacia tree. Now, do I know that to be a fact? No, I don't. And I would never say that's a fact, right? But I think probably it makes sense because they're very long, they're very sharp. If you think about thorns, a lot of things have thorns. Now, roses have thorns, but if you look at acacia tree, it's pretty gnarly. Kind of reminds me of I spent some time, quite a bit of time actually, in the jungles of Panama in Central America when I was in the service because my job had to do with jungle warfare. And anyway, down in that part of the world, there's what they call black palm. And it looks like a wonderful palm tree, except for the fact that it has long, razor sharp thorns on it. And a lot of times in the jungle, they have just whole groves of these things. And in the pitch blackness of the jungle night, trying to maneuver through a jungle full of black palm is not exactly pleasant because it would go. We wore leather gloves as part of our gear back in those days, back in the old Marine Corps, back when it was tough. Anyway, kind of haha. But anyway, those thorns that go right through that leather. So anyway, I would imagine the acacia is probably like that. They use acacia for dye. Some of the if you look at the rabbinical formula for the ink that's used on a Torah scroll, and also for parchment for your mezuzah, that has to be a special type of ink. You just can't use any ink. It has to be made in a special way. And I was reading about the way it was made, and interestingly, I find this interesting, is that the ink, they say in those writings, has to come from a thorn. And naturally, you're probably not surprised to find that the formula, at least in some of the writings I saw, included, it said specifically the gum, the resin that comes from the thorn of an acacia tree. So even the ink that's used on the Torah scroll and the parchments, is made out of acacia. Something else about acacia that's really interesting is that it doesn't, I shouldn't say it doesn't, but it actually is resistant, at least, depending on what you read, whether it's impervious or resistant, but resistant to rot and to decay and to being eaten by bugs and so forth. So that's interesting too, isn't it? So you have everything in the tabernacle that's made out of this wood that has regeneration properties, that has medicinal properties. It's used in medicines. It's used in spiritual incantations. It's used in foods. it has nourishing properties, and it has no decay and so forth. And yes, that's true. The Torah scroll is scored. When you look at a Torah scroll, a page of the Torah scroll, you'll notice that it has lines in it. And the way they create those lines is by taking a thorn, literally, and scoring the parchment. Now, are those thorns that are used exclusively from an acacia tree? I could not find the answer to that. Of course, I have not done an exhaustive search on that, so I don't know if that is the case. I would expect it to be so. It would make sense to me. But then again, I don't know if that is in fact the truth. And again, I always want to respect you, and I want to tell you when I know something to be fact and when I don't. And guys, can I just say, and I don't, pardon me, at risk of sounding whatever, you don't get that in a lot of places. A lot of places they're just going to tell you stuff what they think and their opinions and their blah blah blah, and they're going to present it to you as if it's absolute fact. And I know this is true because I know people go out and find this stuff and they bring it back to me like, this they said blah 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 blah. I'm like, where did they get that from? So we don't do that here. Okay, what you get here is the straight dope. That's probably you get the straight truth, right? If there's an opinion or I think this might have been the case, perhaps I will tell you. Okay, and you can just take it for what it's worth. So so all this about acacia, isn't it fascinating? So everything about the tabernacle is spiritual, everything about it, every aspect of it, and to include, everything's made out of acacia, to include the walls that are hold it up, right? So there's an interesting allegory here about acacia and why the walls are made of acacia wood. And this comes from the Kehot Humash. Let me start with this one. And it says here, the Hebrew word for acacia, which is shita. So acacia wood in Hebrew is shittim, right? So shita means bending. The acacia tree is called the bending tree because it tends to bend to the side as it grows rather than growing straight up. So there's an illusion there because acacia has a humility factor to it. It kind of grows in a bent over form. So when we talk about bending over in terms of bowing, it's an expression of humility. So it goes on to say here, the word for foolishness is shetut. It's another form of this word, since foolishness is an act of bending from the path dictated by logic. So when we bend away, this is just another angle here, no pun intended, but when we bend away from truth, that's where we get into foolishness, right? And so that's kind of part and parcel of what I've been saying this morning. This is why we need to stick to facts, and we need to stick to realities, and don't get emotionally or mentally invested in falsehood. Okay, and that's what happens. And listen, again, I don't want to berate the cross thing, but a lot of people are emotionally and mentally connected to that. I'm not ashamed of the cross, blah 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 blah. I get it. I understand where you're coming from, but you have to understand that emblem is fake. Guys, and this is not just about the symbol of the cross, but it's about anything and everything. Do not get invested in falsehood. You know why? Because what is coupled with falsehood, the pair, right, is depletion. It will never lead you. It will never lead you to satisfaction. It will never lead you to fulfillment. It will never lead you to plenty. It will only lead you to depletion. So don't get invested in falsehood. In fact, the sages warn us to run from falsehood. Separate ourselves. So when you find out something that is fake and phony, dispense with it. Don't play around with it. You say, well, I got a lot of nostalgia. I got a lot of fond memories. I get it. I get you. I understand that. And it doesn't matter. We can have, we have lots of fond memories of things that were just not right for us. And we have to dispense with that. But anyway, I digress. It says foolishness can be either holy or unholy. Unholy foolishness is the illogical thinking that leads to going against God's will, aka his Torah. Okay. Holy foolishness is our willingness to go beyond the strict requirements of the Torah and fulfilling our divine mission and refining ourselves. So this is an important statement, because here a lot of people think that Judaism is the letter of the law and Messiah came along and gave us the spirit of the law. And so the New Testament is the spirit of the law, which is obviously superior. And then you have the letter of the law, which is obviously just, as it turns out, that also is not true, not even remotely. Just like people think that in the Jewish world, we had physical circumcision, and the Messiah came along and gave us circumcision of the heart. That also is not true. What is true is that the spirit coupled with the letter of the law is the right formula, and physical circumcision coupled with circumcision of the heart is also the right formula, and that going beyond the letter of the law and fulfilling, going beyond that to fulfill the spirit and so forth is part and parcel with Jewish thinking. If someone in fact, in Jewish thought, to summarize it, if someone limits themselves to the letter of the law, it says they are in fact a sinner. And so it's interesting, because in rabbinical thinking, if you limit yourself to just, I fulfill the letter of the law, then that will actually lead you to sin. It's an interesting concept. So by keeping the Torah strictly, you could actually be sinning. Isn't that interesting? So it says allegorically then, by placing the bending acacia planks vertically means using our power to be foolish for holy purposes. We can thereby turn this often negative character trait into a positive force in our lives, enabling us to reach levels of dedication to God and union with him that we would not otherwise be able to achieve. Similarly, the word for plank, which is karish, is a permutation of the word for connection, kashar, and also lie, which is sheker. Okay? As material creatures, we are initially related to the world through a predominantly material perspective. As we mature and the Torah's divine perspective increases and takes control of our minds, our consciousness, we realize that our initial material perspective was deception, and that our conviction of its truth was a hindrance to spiritual growth. See, this is kind of what I've been talking about. When we connect emotionally and mentally to falsehood, it actually limits our spiritual growth. So if we're clinging to an emblem, if we're clinging to a belief that is proven to be false, and we're clinging to it only because, nostalgia, only because of we don't want to admit that we're wrong, because somehow we have some kind of weird pride that if we admit that we were wrong, then somehow that makes us bad people or something, like no one's ever been wrong before or something like that. Anyway, whatever the reason is, it limits and prevents our spiritual advancement. So the plank symbolizes us who were connected to the shakar, the lie, chakra, now changing that into a word that means connection, kesher. So it says, by devoting ourselves to our divine calling, we can sever our connection to the lie of materialism and transform our material lives into spiritual planks of our personal divine sanctity. By the way, the resistance to kosher eating, you just want to eat whatever you want to eat, and I don't want to eat kosher. I just want to go to the grocery store and get beef or get chicken. I don't care if it's kosher certified or not. It doesn't matter. Why? And you got to ask yourself the question, why? Why? Answer. Well, it's a connection to materialism. Ultimately, it's a connection to materialism. Really think about it. Ask yourself the question. If that's you and you're having a struggle in that area, Look yourself in the mirror. Nobody's around. It's just you and God. Look yourself in the mirror and say, why? And you'll find out it's just a connection to materialism. Oftentimes it has to do with, well, money, and has to do with convenience, has to do with just, golly, I want it. That's materialism. You won't find in there any type of spirituality. You won't find in that attitude, well, I'm doing this because I really want to serve God. That's not really the answer. Sometimes we try to make ourselves believe that's the answer, but that's only to cover up the materialism. And so the issue of the planks is an issue of overcoming materialism in our life. Now, there's another insight from Rabbi Monk's commentary that says that the wording of this phrase insinuates that these boards, this shittim, is standing erect forever. And so it's talking about here. It's a good insight talking about the everlasting nature of God's truth. Like the Torah is eternal. It will never go away. It will never cease to be. Even the Messiah, do you realize, I know you do, because I'm talking to the Levitical choir here most often. Did you know that even Messiah, the divine Messiah Yeshua, cannot nullify the Torah? It's an impossibility. To nullify the Torah would be to nullify himself. So it kind of makes sense. But a lot of people think, well, the Messiah came and did away with the law. Did you know that that's an impossibility? That would negate him being the Messiah. To abolish Torah is to break Torah, which means that's a sin. To teach people to no longer obey Torah is to teach people to be sinners, which is worse than being a sinner. You see. But one thing I wanted to mention too, before we conclude on this topic, is I wanted to mention the silver bases, because in this discussion of the planks, it talks about putting the planks in the silver bases, and the silver bases are the foundation of the tabernacle. Like the entire tabernacle sits ultimately on a silver base. Now, there's various designs that I've seen with respect to how the silver bases were made. Some suggest, and it's I think more likely that these silver bases were actually constructed to where they had male and female dovetail sections. In other words, when you took a base and you would kind of slip it down into another base, it would form a connected piece, so that when the whole base of the tabernacle was put in place, it was one solid base. And it was interesting because it's made entirely out of silver. Let me read what the Kehut Humash says about these silver bases. It says, as we have seen, the bases were made out of the silver collected with the half shekel tax, which was the same for everyone, whereas the rest of the tabernacle's components were made out of the materials that everyone donated according to the individual ability and generosity. The reason for this distinction, it says, is that the bases were the foundation of the tabernacle, which kept the entire structure standing up firmly. Okay, now this is, and this is where we'll wrap it up, but this is a very important statement, because the half shekel tax that was collected, which is, we are, about to symbolically, as we do every year, collect the half shekel right before the Megillah reading of Esther. This was a universal tax. It was the same for everybody. Didn't matter if you were a king or a pauper. Everybody had to pay the same tax. And those coins for the tabernacle initially were melted down, and that first collection was used to make not just the base of the tabernacle, but if you actually do the math, and there's a math I did on this years ago, that you find that there was an exact amount for the base of the tabernacle, and there's a little bit left over. And when you calculate the amount of silver needed to make the rings of the curtains and juxtapose that to the amount of silver left over from the atonement money, you find that the exact amount that was left over is used for the rings of the curtains, which means that the tabernacle is literally held up, both top and bottom, by atonement. See, silver is a metal that speaks of atonement, redemption, teshuvah. And no matter who we might be a king or we might be a pauper, but ultimately our service to God, which is what the tabernacle represents, is all based on atonement. It's all based on redemption. It's all based on teshuvah. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what's so important, is that when we are establishing a home for God in our lives, we have to make sure that that home, that tabernacle, is founded on atonement. It's founded on redemption. It's founded on our personal teshuvah. And if we don't have that, we don't have anything. There's a lot of people who try to do Torah and they come into this walk, but they're not really born again. They've never really committed their life to Messiah Yeshua. They've never really experienced that atonement. I've seen it too often. It happens not just here, but guys, let's just go back into the church world. I've read stories in my lifetime from major, talking about Christian revivals, in which you have these huge Christian organizations or churches, and somebody comes in there and they start preaching about getting saved, right? Who comes to the altar? The entire choir. Who comes to the altar? Half the staff. Who comes to the altar? Half the church. So we see that a lot of times people connect to religion, but they don't really have a strong foundation. They kind of miss the most important step. They kind of miss the silver foundation. And so before you and I can come to Torah, before we can really start walking in authenticity with HaShem, we have to first get our lives right. We have to first establish the proper foundation. And that begins by having a silver foundation of atonement. And that happens when we make real teshuvah. So don't miss that opportunity, because HaShem will give us many opportunities to make teshuvah. But there comes a point where he kind of cuts us off. Now, at what point does he do that? Only he knows. That's why today, if you hear his voice, harden not your heart. End of our Aliyah today. We'll be back tomorrow with God's help for the 5th Aliyah. Until then, have a beautiful and amazing day. We'll look forward to seeing everybody mañana. And thank you again for being with me. Be sure and like this video, comment on it, share it with your friends. Hope you learned something interesting today. I always find the discussion of acacia wood fascinating. And I always enjoy talking about the silver foundation, because it's really important that we get that right. Obviously, if our foundation is not right, the rest of the tabernacle won't stand up. See you tomorrow with God's help. Shalom Aleichem.